Julian Rose had never intended to spend more than a few quiet months on the Florida coast. But when his distant uncle offered him the chance to stay on an old beachfront property that had been sitting half-empty for years, he accepted with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. The arrangement was simple and perfectly legal. Julian would rent the place long-term, handle the taxes and upkeep, and enjoy the kind of isolation he had been craving after years of working as a consultant in high-stakes negotiations. He was a man who had built a career out of resolving conflicts between corporations, municipalities, and organizations that thrived on tension. Yet, ironically, he had never quite learned how to maintain peace in his own private life. The house by the ocean promised him what he thought he needed most: a space to recover, to write, to rediscover patience and clarity without the constant buzz of boardrooms and hotel lobbies. The property itself was not remarkable at first glance, but Julian saw it differently. It stood on a strip of land where the ocean winds carried the faint scent of salt into every room, and where the waves provided a rhythm that lulled him into a kind of meditative trance each evening. A faded veranda wrapped around the front, and the garden, though overgrown, still held the bones of something once carefully planned, with palm trees leaning toward the shore and patches of sandy soil where flowers had once thrived. The house had been in his uncle's family for decades, and while it showed its age in the form of chipped paint and stubborn shutters, it carried a presence that Julian found grounding. For him it was less about ownership and more about belonging to a place, even temporarily. He had grown tired of anonymous airports and the impersonal sterility of city apartments. Here he could finally imagine mornings that began with coffee on the porch and evenings marked only by the tide. For the first weeks, everything went exactly as he had hoped. He established routines with almost obsessive precision, rising early to walk along the shoreline before the sun scorched the sand, sketching designs and notes in thick leather-bound notebooks during the long, humid afternoons, and cooking simple dinners for himself as the crickets began their nightly chorus. Neighbors were polite but distant, which suited him fine. He was not the kind of man who sought small talk or barbecues. His satisfaction lay in silence, in the uninterrupted control of his hours. Occasionally, he would drive inland for supplies, return with crates of fruit and fresh fish, and spend hours restoring the garden beds, convinced that the act of caring for soil could somehow repair something fractured inside him. It was during one of these evenings, when the air felt heavy with approaching rain and the horizon had turned a bruised purple, that he noticed the first disruption. A low rumble, unlike the natural roar of the sea, vibrated through the ground. He stepped outside, frowning, and watched as heavy trucks rolled down the narrow road that led toward his property. Bright yellow machines followed, their lights cutting through the dusk, their engines announcing intrusion in the most unsubtle way imaginable. At first, Julian assumed there had been a mistake, perhaps road work or the delivery of materials meant for someone else, but when the vehicles turned directly onto the edge of his land and began unloading steel beams and concrete blocks, he felt the unmistakable pull of alarm. He walked closer, certain that a simple question would clear the confusion. But before he could speak, one of the workers in a reflective vest waved casually and shouted over the noise of machinery that everything was fine, that the restoration project was continuing as planned, and that he should not worry. The man spoke with the confidence of someone who had been assured that his authority would not be questioned. Julian stood there, stunned, realizing that he had no idea what restoration project the worker was referring to. The property was private, leased directly to him, and no permits had ever been discussed with his uncle. Yet the crew moved with such determination, pouring sand, drilling into the ground, erecting temporary barriers along the shoreline, that it seemed absurd to imagine they had arrived at the wrong address. He raised his voice, asked who had authorized this work, but the response was vague and dismissive, something about community resilience and hurricane damage, words strung together like an official slogan meant to discourage further inquiry. He felt the old instincts of his profession stirring, recognition of a conflict where one party assumed dominance by sheer force of procedure. That night he sat at the worn wooden table inside the house, staring at papers he had neatly organized. The lease agreement, proof of tax payments, correspondence with his uncle. All perfectly valid, all suddenly fragile in the face of what he had seen. He told himself it was a mistake, perhaps a temporary miscommunication, but unease gnawed at him. The ocean outside pounded against the shore, relentless and steady, as if to remind him that forces larger than his individual will had already begun moving. What disturbed him most was not the noise of the trucks or the arrogance of the workers, but the way they behaved as though his presence was irrelevant, as though the land he lived on had already been claimed by another authority. He did not know it yet, but that single evening marked the beginning of a battle he had never imagined himself fighting, one where the enemy would not be soldiers or executives, but a network of polished documents, signatures, and rules designed to suffocate opposition without ever raising a voice. Julian did not have to wait long before the vague unease of that first evening hardened into something far more concrete and far more dangerous. A week after the trucks had first appeared, after he had convinced himself to tolerate the disruption on the assumption that it would soon end, a thick envelope arrived in his mailbox, its weight alone enough to suggest official importance. The return address carried the name of the Homeowners Association, though Julian had never once been informed that the property fell under their jurisdiction. He opened it slowly, half expecting a notice about road closures or community meetings, but what he found inside nearly made him laugh in disbelief before the absurdity transformed into dread. The letter, written in formal legal language that bristled with authority, claimed that the association had undertaken emergency hurricane repairs along the coastal line adjoining his land, and that his property had been directly integrated into the infrastructure work. The cost of these repairs, the letter continued without hesitation, amounted to $2,500,000, a sum expected to be reimbursed by him immediately, or else pursued through liens and foreclosure. Julian read it twice, then a third time, the words refusing to soften no matter how carefully he studied them. The absurdity struck him like a blow. $2.5 million demanded from a man who was not even the owner, but merely the long-term tenant of a property that had been in his family for decades. He turned the pages over, searching for some error, some clause that revealed it had been sent to the wrong address, but the document named him directly, by full legal name, and listed the parcel number of the land he was living on. It included photographs, aerial views of the coastline marked with colored lines and arrows, annotations describing reinforced barriers, reconstructed drainage systems, and even a partially poured foundation for what was allegedly a protective pavilion. He felt as if he were holding not a bill, but a surreal script written in a language designed to obscure reality, because in truth nothing about what he saw outside matched the glossy images stapled to the notice. The workers had dumped materials, they had driven pilings into the sand, but none of the described improvements existed in the form claimed. The photographs themselves looked suspiciously like digital composites, the kind used in preliminary proposals, not completed projects. He paced the room, letter clutched in his hand, the humid air pressing down on him as though trying to force his acceptance. Every professional instinct told him this was not simply a mistake, but a maneuver, a deliberate creation of pressure in which he was the designated weak link. He dialed his uncle, who sounded both confused and frightened when Julian explained the demand. The older man swore he had never received any communication from the association, insisted that the house had been excluded from the HOA decades earlier when the rules were rewritten, and argued that the family had fought precisely to keep the property independent. Julian pressed for clarity, but the conversation yielded only uncertainty. His uncle repeated that if something had changed, it had done so without his consent, and perhaps, he admitted reluctantly, without his full attention, since he had signed various papers in recent years to settle minor disputes about zoning and taxes. The more Julian thought about it, the clearer it became that the workers' casual dismissal of him that first night had not been accidental. They had behaved as though his presence meant nothing because in their records, on their spreadsheets and balance sheets, his land had already been absorbed into their project. The letter was not a request. It was a confirmation of something already filed and approved, a demand for payment that assumed he was powerless to contest. He considered calling immediately, but the letter provided no direct number to the office, only a generic line that redirected him through endless menus until finally an answering machine instructed him to submit disputes in writing. He hung up, unsettled by the way the system seemed designed to deter live conversation. The following morning, he walked the property carefully, studying each mark and barrier with the eye of someone accustomed to reading negotiations in gestures rather than words. He noticed that sections of his fence had been moved outward by a few feet, as though the boundary of his lot had been quietly redrawn. Temporary markers, thin rods with bright tape, had been driven into the soil in neat rows leading toward the shoreline, each one labeled with coded numbers and acronyms. These were not the signs of emergency repairs but of planned construction, the kind of methodical preparation that precedes commercial development. He crouched by one of the markers, brushing sand away to reveal a small laminated tag that listed the initials of a contracting firm he did not recognize. He pulled out his phone, searching for the company, and discovered it was a newly registered entity with no history, no previous projects, and an address that led only to a shared office building inland. That night, another letter arrived, this time thinner but sharper in tone. It stated that his failure to respond within 72 hours would be taken as implied acceptance of the charges. The sum, it repeated with bureaucratic confidence, would be subject to collection through liens, and if necessary, foreclosure proceedings would begin regardless of his tenant status. He felt the weight of a trap tightening around him, not with violence or noise, but with the suffocating silence of paperwork that assumed his compliance. His training as a mediator told him this was not random. Such tactics were designed to overwhelm, to make resistance seem futile before it had even begun. He sat in the dark living room, listening to the waves crashing against the shore, and for the first time since arriving, he felt no peace in their rhythm. The ocean had become a witness to his dispossession, a vast, indifferent presence beside which his outrage seemed small. Yet, beneath the dread, there flickered something else, a cold, measured determination that came from years of standing between warring parties. He understood now that he had not been mistaken to feel irrelevant that first night. He was not a person to them, not even a name. He was a figure on a ledger, a liability to be converted into profit through process and persistence. And if he did nothing, the ledger would swallow him whole. Julian decided that waiting in silence would only tighten the noose around him, so within days he prepared a folder of every document he possessed and drove into town to confront the association directly, reasoning that face-to-face dialogue might yield clarity where letters and voicemail only generated delay. The HOA office was tucked inside a nondescript commercial strip beside a dental clinic and a dry cleaner, its glass door plastered with cheerful posters about community improvement and resilience. But the moment he stepped inside, he sensed the dissonance between the bright marketing and the cold machinery of bureaucracy humming beneath. A receptionist greeted him with the kind of perfunctory politeness that suggested his presence was unwelcome, and when he explained his situation, she listened with the blank expression of someone trained to deflect rather than resolve. After an extended pause, she disappeared into the back, and moments later a man in a tailored suit appeared, his smile so thin it seemed carved from obligation rather than courtesy. He introduced himself as Edgar Stone, president of the association, and invited Julian into a conference room that felt more like an interrogation chamber than a community office. Julian laid out his folder, methodically presenting his lease agreement, tax receipts, and even photographs of the property taken when he first moved in, pointing out that none of the supposed repairs listed in their letters had been completed and that the land had never been under their jurisdiction. Stone listened in silence, occasionally scribbling something on a legal pad, his expression betraying neither agreement nor interest. When Julian finished, Stone leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture that struck Julian as rehearsed, and began to speak in the slow, deliberate tone of a man used to reciting lines crafted by attorneys. He acknowledged the confusion, expressed vague sympathy, and then declared with absolute certainty that the property did indeed fall under HOA control as of a bylaw revision enacted 2 years earlier. According to him, the moment Julian's uncle renewed certain county filings, the land reverted into the association's jurisdiction, and all responsibilities, including financial obligations for emergency repairs, transferred accordingly. Julian pressed him, insisting that no such agreement existed, and that his uncle had never knowingly submitted to HOA authority. Stone shrugged with practiced indifference, suggesting that perhaps the older man had failed to read the fine print, but that legally it made no difference. The repairs had been authorized, contractors had been deployed, and the costs, staggering as they seemed, were already logged. Payment, therefore, was not a matter of negotiation, but of compliance. What unsettled Julian most was not merely the arrogance of Stone's words, but the calm certainty with which he delivered them, as if he had already calculated Julian's inability to mount a serious challenge. When Julian demanded to see copies of the permits that supposedly authorized construction on his land, Stone's demeanor cooled further. He stated that such documents were internal and not available for casual inspection, but that Julian was free to file a formal request under the association's review procedures, a process that could take months. He smiled faintly as he added that in the meantime interest on the debt would continue to accumulate, implying that by the time Julian received any paperwork, the figure might well exceed $3 million. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would only make the burden heavier. Driving home afterward, Julian felt the first true wave of anger replacing confusion. He realized that Stone's strategy was deliberate, a demonstration of dominance meant to establish that the association held every card while he held none. Yet, in that very arrogance, Julian recognized an opening, because experience had taught him that people who relied too heavily on intimidation often concealed flaws in their position. He began keeping a meticulous log of every interaction, every letter, every word exchanged, convinced that somewhere in the details lay the fracture he could exploit. But the HOA did not wait for him to regroup. Within days, notices began arriving not only in his mailbox but also pinned to his fence, slipped under his door, and even handed to him by contractors who continued to appear on his land as though it already belonged to them. One letter announced that since he had not remitted payment, a lien had been filed with the county recorder. Another warned that continued obstruction of construction would be met with legal action. The most chilling came late one evening. A curt statement that his presence on the site without coordination might constitute trespassing under HOA policy, effectively suggesting that the tenant of the land could be treated as an intruder. Julian understood then that the association's aggression was not limited to paperwork, but extended to the physical reclamation of his environment. The trucks returned in greater numbers, this time unloading prefabricated slabs and steel reinforcements that were stacked carelessly on his lawn as though it were nothing more than a storage yard. Workers drilled deep holes in the sand and poured concrete footings mere yards from his veranda, the roar of machinery drowning the ocean's natural rhythm. Each time he confronted them, demanding to know under what authority they acted, the foreman would simply shrug and point to a clipboard, muttering that the HOA had signed off and that his objections were irrelevant. For the first time, Julian felt the boundaries of his life eroding in tangible form. The space that had seemed a sanctuary reduced to contested ground where his voice carried no weight. He contacted a county clerk in desperation, only to be told that permits on file listed the HOA as the responsible entity, with signatures that appeared authentic and official. When he asked who had signed, the clerk recited his uncle's name. The shock left him momentarily speechless, for his uncle had sworn he had never signed such documents. Whether the man had been deceived or the papers forged outright, Julian could not yet say, but the realization deepened his sense of isolation. As night fell and the last trucks rumbled away, he stood on the veranda staring at the half-built structures rising on the sand. Skeletal forms that seemed less like fortifications against hurricanes and more like monuments to his powerlessness. The air was heavy with dust and the acrid scent of cement, and he could no longer hear the ocean without also hearing the grind of machinery that now claimed dominance. He knew then that he was no longer merely facing a bureaucratic nuisance, but an orchestrated assault on his right to exist in the place he had chosen as refuge. And though he had built his career mediating between hostile forces, this conflict offered no neutral ground, no compromise that could preserve both sides. Either he would resist and risk everything, or he would concede and watch the land disappear beneath a weight of debt and concrete poured in someone else's name. Julian had grown accustomed to difficult negotiations in his professional life, but nothing in his past prepared him for the disorienting mixture of legal jargon, bureaucratic stonewalling, and physical encroachment that now defined his existence on the coast. Days blurred into each other as he documented every intrusion, yet the sense of inevitability pressing down on him grew heavier, like an undertow pulling him steadily out to sea. He refused to abandon the property, even as contractors trampled over his garden and trucks gouged ruts into his driveway, but the isolation of his struggle gnawed at him, and he began to feel as if the world beyond the HOA's paperwork had turned its face away. The county offices answered his calls with polite dismissals, insisting that the association's filings were in order and that any grievances should be handled through civil channels. His uncle, when pressed, grew evasive, muttering about documents he might have signed without full attention, then cutting the conversation short with abrupt excuses. It was only when Julian, in sheer desperation, made an unannounced visit to the county building department that the first fracture appeared in the wall of certainty surrounding him. He walked into the public records office, past rows of clerks and shelves stacked with boxes of permits, and demanded to see the authorizations for the construction on his land. The woman at the desk, tired but sympathetic, tapped at her keyboard and printed a thin file. Julian scanned the pages and his stomach tightened as he read the signatures. His uncle's name appeared in neat cursive, but something felt wrong. The handwriting was oddly consistent, too uniform, lacking the hesitations and small variations that real signatures always carried. More disturbing was the date, 3 months prior, during a week when his uncle had been hospitalized for surgery. Julian pressed the clerk, who frowned and admitted that the document had been filed electronically, with only a scanned signature attached. When Julian asked whether the office verified such signatures against previous records, she shook her head, explaining that the system relied on trust in the submitting party, which in this case had been the HOA's legal representative. Julian left the office with copies of the permits clutched in his hand, a rush of vindication mingled with dread. The realization struck with brutal clarity. The association had not simply twisted the rules, they had fabricated the foundation of their authority. Yet exposing that truth would not be simple, because the documents bore the county's official stamps, and until proven otherwise, they carried the presumption of legitimacy. He knew that shouting forgery without proof would only play into their strategy, painting him as hysterical and resistant to community safety measures. What he needed was evidence that the documents were not merely questionable, but impossible. That night, as the wind howled across the shoreline and rattled the half-built structures, Julian sat at his table, spreading the papers before him like pieces of a puzzle. He examined the digital printouts closely, noting small details that did not align. The same notary seal appearing twice in different formats, the identical slant of his uncle's signature on separate pages, the metadata at the bottom of one form, revealing that it had been created using a software program designed for drafting contracts rather than scanning originals. These were not mistakes made in haste, but deliberate manipulations intended to withstand casual scrutiny. For the first time since the ordeal began, Julian felt the stirring of a strategy taking shape. The following morning, he arranged a meeting with a former colleague who now worked as a handwriting analyst for a private security firm. Though reluctant to involve others in what still felt like a deeply personal battle, Julian recognized that his expertise as a negotiator had limits. He needed technical confirmation. The colleague reviewed the signatures, his brow furrowing as he compared them with older documents Julian had brought from his uncle's files. After a long silence, he concluded, with cautious professionalism, that the signatures were almost certainly forged. Not through crude imitation, but by digital replication from previous forms. The consistency was too perfect, the alignment too mechanical. Julian felt a grim satisfaction, though it was tempered by the analyst's warning that proving such forgery in court would require access to the original submission files, which the HOA would guard fiercely. Armed with this knowledge, Julian pressed further. He filed a request with the county for all records relating to the coastal reinforcement project, not just his property, but the surrounding parcels as well. Weeks later, a packet arrived, heavy with maps and budgets. He spread them across his table and immediately noticed that his lot was highlighted in bold red, labeled as a critical anchor site for the construction of a continuous barrier. Without his land, the entire project would be segmented, and the financing, largely dependent on federal disaster relief funds, would collapse. He realized with a surge of clarity that this was never about repairs to protect his home. It was about using his land as collateral for a larger scheme. The association needed his property not because of damage, but because without it, they could not justify the millions already requested in grants and loans. Julian walked the shoreline again, this time seeing the landscape with different eyes. The pilings driven into the sand were not placed to protect his house, but to form the foundation of a structure that extended beyond his boundary, an artificial bulwark designed to impress auditors rather than withstand storms. The so-called repairs were theater, staged for photographs and reports that would be filed in distant offices where no one would ever set foot on the beach. He crouched near one of the concrete slabs and brushed away sand to reveal a stencil, the name of a contractor tied to one of the largest real estate development firms in the state. It was then that the final piece clicked into place. The association had no intention of maintaining the existing neighborhood. They were laying the groundwork for a new development, one that would erase the current residents and replace them with a profitable enclave. The revelation struck him with both fury and clarity. His battle was not against random incompetence, but against a coordinated attempt to convert his life into a line item on someone else's ledger. The enormity of it threatened to overwhelm him, yet paradoxically it also steadied him, because now he understood the stakes. They had no intention of backing down because the survival of their entire scheme depended on making his resistance vanish. And if he allowed himself to be pushed aside, not only would he lose the sanctuary he had carved out on the coast, but he would also become complicit in the quiet theft of land disguised as community improvement. That night he lay awake, listening to the unfinished skeletons of concrete echoing the wind, and made a decision. He would not merely defend his position with words and protests. He would attack their foundation with the only weapon they feared, proof of their illegitimacy. He would gather every inconsistency, every fraudulent stamp, every manipulated signature, and build a case not in the court of neighbors or even local offices, but in the one place that could not be ignored. The federal oversight agencies responsible for disaster funds. He knew it would be slow, exhausting, and dangerous. But he also knew that for the first time since the ordeal began, he was no longer simply reacting to their pressure. He had discovered their vulnerability, and in that discovery he had reclaimed the faint but vital sense of control that might one day allow him to dismantle the fortress they were constructing on his stolen ground. Julian's discovery that the entire project hinged on the fraudulent incorporation of his land into the coastal barrier scheme gave him a clarity of purpose, but it also painted a target on his back in ways he had not fully anticipated. The moment he began filing formal complaints and attaching documentation that questioned the legitimacy of the permits, the atmosphere around him shifted from aggressive indifference to calculated hostility. The trucks did not stop arriving, but their operators no longer ignored him. They stared openly, some with smirks, as if daring him to interfere. Notices multiplied in his mailbox, written in increasingly threatening tones, and new copies were delivered directly to his porch even when he had not seen anyone approach, as though invisible hands wanted to remind him that his private space was no longer private at all. What unsettled him more than the paperwork was the silence from his uncle, who, when confronted with the evidence of forged signatures, avoided his calls altogether. The implication was inescapable. Either the man had been pressured into complicity, or he was too afraid to admit how far the manipulation had gone. Julian pressed on, determined to break through the wall of isolation. He mailed certified copies of the fraudulent documents to a regional office overseeing disaster relief funds, attaching his analysis of the forged signatures and inconsistencies. He did not expect immediate action, but he knew that once such evidence entered a federal record, it could not easily be erased. The HOA must have sensed this, because within days of his submission, their tactics escalated. A new letter arrived, accusing him of obstructing essential safety work and warning that his continued interference placed him at risk of civil liability for any future storm damage in the community. The logic was twisted but effective. They were attempting to recast him as the villain who endangered his neighbors by resisting improvements. Soon after, one of the contractors approached him with a clipboard, informing him in a rehearsed tone that if he did not vacate the property during construction hours, his presence might constitute a safety violation. Julian recognized the tactic at once. It was an attempt to normalize his exclusion, to reduce him from resident to trespasser by the slow erosion of authority. Even as the harassment grew, Julian refused to be intimidated, but the psychological toll was undeniable. At night he heard footsteps crunching outside the house, too deliberate to be the wind, too fleeting to confirm. The floodlights sometimes flickered, though the wiring was new. Once he found the gate to his driveway left wide open in the morning, despite having locked it himself before bed. He could not prove that anyone had entered, but the message was clear. They wanted him to feel watched, unsettled, exhausted. The combination of legal threats and subtle intrusions was designed to weaken him until he surrendered. But, rather than break, the pressure only deepened his resolve. He began compiling a chronology of every incident, annotating it with times, dates, and cross-references to official documents. His training in conflict resolution taught him that power often lies not in emotion, but in meticulous records, and he was determined to turn their own tools against them. It was during one of these long nights of cataloging that Julian uncovered an even darker layer. Buried among the county files he had requested was a memo referencing a loan agreement between the HOA and a development firm, with collateral described as secured coastal parcels pending formal transfer. His lot was specifically mentioned by number, even though no legal transfer had occurred. The implication was staggering. The HOA had leveraged his property as collateral for millions in financing without his consent, effectively betting the success of their project on his unwillingness to resist. If the scheme collapsed, they would default, but if they succeeded in forcing him out, they stood to gain not only reimbursement for construction, but ownership of land that had never belonged to them. Julian confronted Stone once more, this time with the memo in hand. The meeting was colder, sharper than the last. Stone did not deny the existence of the loan, but insisted that the inclusion of Julian's parcel was standard procedure, nothing more than a placeholder until records caught up. His calmness infuriated Julian, but it also revealed a crack. Stone was no longer pretending the association acted purely in the community's interest. The financial motives were undeniable, and the confidence with which he dismissed Julian's objections carried a hint of desperation, as though he feared what might happen if those motives were exposed. In the days that followed, retaliation intensified. County inspectors appeared at Julian's door, claiming they had received anonymous complaints about code violations on his property, unsafe wiring, unregistered structures, even accusations of illegal dumping. Though each allegation dissolved upon inspection, the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was weaponizing bureaucracy against him, sending officials not to enforce the law, but to wear him down. The visits disrupted his work, consumed his energy, and spread whispers among neighbors who began to view him with suspicion. The once indifferent community now eyed him as a troublemaker, reinforcing the association's narrative that he was obstructing safety. Despite the isolation, Julian sensed momentum shifting in subtle ways. The federal office acknowledged receipt of his complaint, though they offered no promises, and one county employee, lowering his voice as he handed over routine documents, muttered that several people in the department had long questioned the HOA's methods but lacked the courage to speak openly. That small flicker of solidarity reminded Julian that corruption often relies on silence, and that his persistence might inspire others to break it. By the time another official notice arrived, this one demanding immediate payment under threat of foreclosure, Julian no longer felt the helpless panic that had seized him in the beginning. Instead, he felt the steel of conviction settling into place. They had escalated their attacks because they knew he had found their weak point. And though every day grew heavier, every night more restless, he also knew that the storm was reaching its peak, and that once it broke, the careful edifice they had built on deception could no longer stand unchallenged. The courtroom was not a place Julian had expected to find himself when he first set foot on the quiet strip of coastline, but as he sat at the polished wooden table facing the bench, he realized there was no other possible destination for the path he had been forced down. The association had made good on its threats, filing for foreclosure under the claim that he owed $2.5 million in recovery costs, and Julian, armed with his folder of documents and a determination honed by months of harassment, had filed his counteraction accusing them of fraud, forgery, and abuse of authority. The hearing drew more attention than he anticipated. Several neighbors filled the gallery, some curious, others hostile, and at least one who nodded toward him with quiet encouragement. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for impartiality, opened proceedings with the expectation that this would be another tedious property dispute. But as the hours unfolded, it became evident that what sat before her was not a minor disagreement, but a scheme whose exposure might ripple far beyond the town. The association's lawyers presented their case first, their arguments rehearsed and polished. They spoke of community safety, of the urgent need to act after hurricanes, of the shared responsibility of property owners to contribute to resilience. They produced glossy photographs of barriers and reinforced structures, insisting that the costs were real and justified, and that Julian, as the resident of a critical parcel, was legally bound to shoulder his portion. Their confidence was palpable, and for a moment Julian feared the narrative would overwhelm the truth, because it was couched in the language of responsibility and public good. But when his turn came, he rose with a calm steadiness, laying out the chain of evidence with the precision of a man who had spent his life untangling conflicts. He began not with accusations, but with questions, asking the court to examine the permits submitted by the HOA. He pointed out the identical signatures, the notary seals replicated in impossible ways, the dates that coincided with his uncle's hospitalization. He explained the process by which disaster relief funds were allocated, and how his parcel had been fraudulently inserted as collateral for loans that could not have been secured otherwise. Piece by piece, the illusion of legitimacy cracked. The judge leaned forward, scrutinizing the documents, her expression tightening as Julian revealed the metadata showing that the so-called scanned signatures had been generated in contract software. He presented the memo referencing collateralized parcels, reading aloud the line that listed his property despite no legal transfer. The association's attorneys objected, tried to dismiss his findings as speculative, but the weight of inconsistencies grew too heavy to brush aside. The turning point came when a county clerk subpoenaed by Julian's motion testified under oath that no original signed permits existed in the record, only electronic submissions from the HOA's legal office. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, and for the first time Stone, sitting behind his attorneys, shifted uncomfortably, his composure cracking. Julian closed his argument not with anger, but with a simple statement that carried more force than threats: that if the court allowed such practices to stand, any property could be stolen not through open theft, but through paperwork forged with enough confidence, and that the very idea of ownership would dissolve under the weight of fraud disguised as civic duty. When he sat down, his hands trembled, not from fear but from the exhaustion of having laid everything bare. The judge recessed briefly, then returned with a ruling that cut through the tension like a blade. The foreclosure was dismissed with prejudice, the liens declared void, and the association was ordered to reimburse Julian's legal costs while the matter of forged documents was referred to the state attorney's office for criminal investigation. Gasps rippled through the gallery, neighbors whispering in disbelief as the carefully constructed authority of the HOA collapsed in a single pronouncement. Stone stood, his face pale as though the foundation beneath him had crumbled, and for once he had no words. Julian, though victorious, felt no triumph in the moment, only a profound weariness, because the fight had consumed more of him than he had imagined possible. Yet, as he left the courtroom and stepped into the sunlight, he felt the weight begin to lift, and he understood that the tide had finally turned. When the ruling was delivered and the immediate threat lifted, Julian thought he would simply retreat back into silence, patch the wounds of the battle, and try to reclaim the quiet life he had imagined when he first arrived at the coastal house. But the aftermath proved more complicated, for victory had altered not only his standing but also the community around him. The contractors vanished almost overnight, leaving behind half-finished slabs of concrete that now stood like relics of an abandoned ambition. The neighbors who had once looked at him with suspicion now approached hesitantly, offering apologies or excuses, their words betraying a mixture of relief and shame. Some admitted that they had feared the association's power too much to speak. Others confessed they had believed the lies about him until the evidence became impossible to ignore. Julian listened but did not dwell on resentment. He understood that fear bends people more easily than conviction ever straightens them. Stone resigned within a week, his name already circulating in whispers as investigators began probing the forged permits and the questionable loans. Rumors spread that federal auditors had arrived quietly to examine how disaster funds had been funneled, and though Julian knew it might take years for the full truth to surface, he took comfort in knowing the machinery had been set in motion. His uncle, finally breaking the silence, wrote him a letter confessing that he had indeed signed certain papers without understanding their implications, and that guilt had kept him from speaking earlier. Julian did not answer immediately, for the wound of betrayal was still fresh, but he felt the faint stirrings of forgiveness, because the real culprits had relied precisely on such confusion to build their scheme. In the weeks that followed, Julian began restoring the property, not with grand plans but with small gestures, replanting the garden where the soil had been torn, mending the sections of fence that had been pushed aside, clearing the debris left by machines that had claimed dominion over his ground. Each act was a quiet reclaiming, a reminder that land was not merely lines on paper but a living space shaped by care. He no longer imagined the coast as a place of escape, but as a place of survival, a stage on which he had been tested and forced to recognize his own resilience. The ocean returned to its rhythm, steady and indifferent. But now he heard in its roar not detachment, but endurance, a lesson that even relentless waves could be resisted if one stood firm long enough. And as he sat again on the veranda in the evenings, the sky painted with the fading light, Julian knew the battle had cost him more than he ever intended to give. Yet in surviving it, he had claimed something no association could ever seize: a proof that integrity, though fragile, could withstand even the weight of fabricated authority.